Raymond had just entered the bedroom when he heard his wife make this passionate declaration. Dorothy had a knack for blowing up in his face. They were on a second date and at a highly recommended restaurant when Dorothy's food arrived, and she quickly discovered the meat wasn't cooked to her order. She was in the middle of an exchange with the waitress who'd brought their meals when a male waiter stepped in and claimed they would have to be charged for the extra meal. The extra meal was the final straw for Dorothy. She let the waiter have it with both barrels, using language that was decidedly unladylike. They were eventually asked to leave, but not before getting the satisfaction of knowing the waiter was terminated. That was Raymond's first experience with Dorothy's emotional outbursts. Although there had been several more such incidents since their wedding day, very few had been directed at him in the last 23 years. This was one of those times. "Idiot! Get into the living room right this instant!" Dorothy screamed at Raymond. He hadn't. He'd heard her come in the house, and he figured she'd be gone for a bit. He let out a big sigh. Raymond thought about just ignoring his wife, but that would only delay things. He needed to get to the bottom of what was upsetting her. He turned on his heel and walked down the wooden hallway, his footsteps echoing weirdly in the silence. He went into the carpeted living room. The living room always reminded Raymond of an austere. The living room was decorated with modern furniture from a popular Swedish furniture store. The eclectic simplicity of the room's layout seemed out of place in a home, but Dorothy liked it, so Raymond put up with it. Dorothy asked Ray, "What is it?" in a calm but firm manner. He was calm but clearly upset. He was actually furious at Dorothy for being so dismissive. It was getting more difficult to deal with her vicious digs. "Don't you dare act innocent," said Dorothy in a tone that made it clear she was not going to be treated with kid gloves. "Timothy here has told me the scoop on you, Raymond." Raymond had noticed Timothy Hannity when he'd walked into the living room, but he'd never cared for the man, and now even less so. He hadn't bothered to acknowledge him. "I see," he remarked nonchalantly, letting the moment drag on into a tense silence. "What scoop might that be?" While studiously ignoring Hannity, Dorothy began to speak. Her fury was renewed, but Raymond spoke up louder and more vehemently than she could have ever imagined. He was even more outraged than she was. Outburst what she started to demand loudly, Raymond shouted again, then more quietly, "I said shut up, and I meant shut up. Do you understand?" he asked his wife. "Don't say a word, just nod if you understand." Glancing at Timothy, who seemed to be in his own state of shock, Dorothy couldn't. Raymond was determined not to let this defiance of his authority go unanswered. Especially in front of company, and especially in front of Timothy. "How dare you?" he shouted, spittle flying out of his mouth. "I should keep quiet," he added, his anger evident. Raymond's words were more guttural than he'd intended. Dorothy could tell he was angry, maybe even furious, by the way his chest heaved with passion. "If you can't talk normally and without calling me names, then leave and don't return," Dorothy said, her voice just as angry as before. "Otherwise, explain yourself." Despite her face burning with embarrassment and splotched with anger, Dorothy managed to rein in her usual boldness and resort to a lower level of volume. She'd never experienced her husband's gaze on such a scale, and it bothered her to the point where she felt cautious. "I think it was probably the best option. If you'd heard what I just did with Timothy, you'd be upset too," she explained to her husband, smiling at him briefly but keeping his gaze. This way, she refused to look at Timothy. Raymond asked Dorothy, "What do you mean?" "Have you heard that upset you, dear wife?" There was no discernible anger in his voice, but the flatness of his words reinforced the state of his volatile emotions, despite the tense atmosphere. Dorothy charged forward, saying that he'd seen you with a blonde. Raymond motioned for her to continue. He'd seen other people too, dying together in a very friendly way after a moment of silence. Dorothy seemed to relish the discomfort of her husband. Raymond asked somewhat reservedly, "Okay, what else?" Dorothy pounced. "You'd been seen entering a motel room." "With that woman," she said it almost triumphantly. "So is it true?" Raymond nodded slowly and replied resignedly, "Yes, it's all true." His eyes flickered towards Timothy for just a moment, and he saw that worthless piece of dung smirking in satisfaction. "Ah, I got you." Dorothy started up loudly in her righteous indignation. "Get the duck out," she returned more loudly than before in a stentorian tone. "I said I meant it when I said to leave if you were going to start shouting and swearing. So leave just then." The doorbell rang. Its cheerful chimes rang melodiously in the chilled silence. "I think that's for one of you," Raymond said in a mysterious way. A look of confusion mixed with uncertainty crossed both Dorothy and Timothy's faces at Raymond's cryptic message. Then the doorbell rang again. Raymond advised, "One of you should answer it cheerily." He smiled slightly as he spoke. Dorothy turned towards the foyer to open the door, and Raymond saw that she looked annoyed. Timothy watched her back as she opened the door. A short, plump woman came in, looking both harried and angry. She pushed past an open. Dorothy stopped abruptly in the center of the living room and waved a folder in front of her as she spoke directly to Raymond. "Is it true?" Raymond nodded sadly and said, "I'm afraid so. It's been verified by a bona fide investigator, Miss Hannity. I'd like to apologize for meeting with you like this," sporting an angry frown. Vera Hannity. "No, I'm sorry for having to meet like this." Then she turned to face her husband Timothy, who was now cowering. She pointed at him with an extended arm and a stiff finger and ordered, "Get home now. We're going to have a meeting and you're definitely not going to like it." The smirk that had been on his face moments ago was all but wiped off as he stared at the floor rather than look at his wife in the face. He looked at the floor, not his wife. "Yes, dear, I can explain. Don't call me dear, and you'll explain a lot of things now." Timothy Hannity shuffled out the front door, not daring to look at Dorothy as he left her home. Vera Hannity followed but stopped short of Dorothy. She looked at her contemptuously and said, "Which?" Dorothy slowly closed the front door, wondering what had just happened. How had things been so neatly turned around? Her husband had done this. He'd cheated. He'd even admitted to it. She was going to take everything he owned. She never admitted to any such thing. What she had admitted to was being seen with a blonde. "I was dining with a woman with red hair and I took her to a motel room. Dorothy, she's a private investigator I hired from Atlanta. She followed you and Timothy off and on for 2 months, but she got plenty of evidence during that time. When we met up, she could give me what she'd collected and explain a few things. My divorce attorney is also Timothy's lawyer. By the time Timothy had followed me, we were already wrapping up the investigation. He saw me at the motel with my husband, who'd accompanied me. She's here, so I didn't care if he saw me with her." He heard Dorothy gasp in pain as he explained the situation. "As for you, the main thing is that the house stays with me since I owned it before I even met you. After that, we both keep our respective 401ks and savings accounts. Our current account has been used up, along with paying the monthly bills, our daughter's college tuition, and of course the services of a private investigator. Those people aren't cheap." After a moment's thought, he added, "I also had to pay my attorney." He looked at his wife. He saw her face twist into an unpleasant grimace as if she were in pain. "Don't worry, I didn't leave you totally destitute. You have enough in the checking account to cover a divorce attorney and a place to live." She started to cry. I'm sorry, please, Raymond. He didn't mean anything. Please forgive me. I'll change, I promise. I really will, please." Her nose started to run with tears. "I'm so sorry, I beg you." Raymond spoke over her woeful cries, his voice unmoved by her seeming remorse. "If you and Timothy had just waited to come home just a bit later, everything would have been in place. But since you all decided to arrive early, it threw off the schedule anyway. Your suitcases are packed and they're in the foyer closet, ready for you. I'll get the furniture." Raymond continued, "You can keep the furniture. I've never liked it, but I put up with it because you enjoyed it. So, take it all. I'm going to refurbish all the rooms." Raymond explained the dissolution of their property calmly. It seemed as if he didn't care that he'd admitted he'd never liked the furniture. It hurt her more than his finding out about her cheating. Then the doorbell rang again. "I think this time I can say with utmost certainty it's for you." Raymond said, "I'll get it," in a satisfied tone as he pulled suitcases out of the coat closet. She was still sobbing loudly and her face was smeared with snot and tears, but she answered the door as an automaton would. The tall gentleman standing there seemed surprised to see her in such disarray, but he didn't miss a beat and asked, "Are you Dorothy Stevens?" She gave a slight nod. He asked her in a neutral voice to show her ID. "What's this about?" she asked plaintively. Fear began to grow in her stomach as she guessed at the man's intention. Please, Mrs. Stevens, will you show me your—" the man asked again, more sternly. Dorothy went to her purse, got her driver's license and some tissues to clean her face. She gave the man her license back at the door. The man took her license and compared the photo on it to the sheet of paper he was holding. He nodded in satisfaction, then handed her a folded set of papers wrapped in blue. He said, "You've been served. Thank you for your cooperation. Have a good day." Then he took a quick photo of her holding the folded papers with his cell phone. She watched the man walk away, quickly enter his car and drive off. She'd stopped crying, but it came back as things began to sink in. She stood there, dumbly. In the doorway she stood silent and swaying, waiting without any idea of what was going to happen next. A few seconds later, her sister Chris arrived with their mother. They parked along the curb but got out and rushed up to her. "Are you okay, Di?" Chris asked what was wrong, and her mum asked with what Ray thought was fake concern, as her eldest daughter just stood there unresponsive. Dorothy opened her mouth and moved her jaw up and down, but all that came out was a low whimper of pain. She turned to the man who was her son. In-law Ava asked him what he'd done to her daughter. Raymond bent down to pick up one of Dorothy's cases, saying calmly, "Nothing. She did it." His response made his wife frown angrily. "Stop with the riddles," she said. "What do you mean by that?" AA spoke with authority, walking up to his weeping wife and looking over her shoulder at his mother-in-law. "She doesn't like the consequences of her cheating," he said. "One of those consequences was that I filed for divorce. It's very simple." "Before either of you two get involved," he said. Laws could respond. He quickly continued, "If you two would be so kind as to help Dorothy carry her clothes and suitcases to her car. She'll really need all of this every day. That's why I asked you both to come here to help her. She can go back and box the rest of her stuff. I'll even let her store all that stuff in the garage until she gets a storage room." Chris shared a bewildered look with her mother. "Is this true?" she asked, hinting at betrayal in her voice. Dorothy, her eyes red and puffy, nodded amidst her sobs. Ava, who was never the softest person, pulled her daughter into an embrace, showing her support regardless of the mistake. "Di, you can stay in your old room for a while, but Mom," the scandal Chris started, was only silenced by Ava gave her a stern look. "There won't be any more scandals, Christine. This is between family. We'll deal with the rest later," Eva said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. Raymond watched the scene, his heart heavy, but his decision unyielding. He'd played the role. Ava and Chris had been understanding partners for too long, and Dorothy's betrayal was the final straw. They helped a broken Dorothy into the car. Raymond stepped forward. Dorothy called out softly. She turned towards him, her eyes a mess of confusion, pain, and a plea for something she herself couldn't. "I hope you find what you're looking for, what you couldn't find with us. That's all I can say." He turned and walked back into the house, closing the door softly behind him. The sound was like the end of their many years together was echoing with a quiet agitation and sadness, as if it was a love that never was inside the quiet house. Raymond stood alone in the middle of the living room. He glanced around at the furniture Dorothy had chosen, and the decor she loved, all echoing a life that was no longer his, and a woman he no longer knew. It was time for a new beginning. He realized this for both of them. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his phone and dialed. "Hello, yes. Is this the Furniture Donation Center? I have some items to give away."